Three identical little girls walked into a billionaire's office, handed him a red paper crane, and said, "Mom said you'd understand." He did. And his world unraveled. The morning began like any other for Alexander Weston, CEO of Weston Tech, one of the most powerful and fastest-growing tech corporations in North America. His office, perched high above Manhattan on the 50th floor, gleamed with a minimalistic, modern elegance, glass walls, a pristine white desk, subtle lighting, and an uninterrupted view of the New York skyline. The air smelled faintly of imported Colombian roast and polished wood. He liked his world controlled, clean, and precise. People admired his discipline, feared his mind, and respected his distance. To the world, he was a genius in a tailored suit, a man who had mastered time, risk, and opportunity. But behind all of that brilliance was a fortress carefully built to keep his past where it belonged, in silence. That day, he had just dismissed his assistant with a clipped nod and sat down with his second espresso when something odd happened. The double doors to his office opened quietly, not rushed, not dramatic, but with such calm certainty that it unsettled him before he even looked up. Three little girls walked in. They were no older than 6. Blonde hair, soft waves that caught the morning light. Eyes so blue, they felt almost surreal, like they weren't real children but sketches brought to life. They were dressed in pale-colored summer dresses, their shoes clean but slightly scuffed at the toes, as though they had walked a long way or wandered without being carried. They didn't speak at first. They simply stood there, still and confident, as though this tower, this office, this man, none of it intimidated them. They looked around only once, and then all three turned their gaze to him. Alexander stood up sharply. His instinct, as always, was to take control, to demand answers. But something about the way they looked at him stole the words from his throat. A strange tremor fluttered in his chest. The one in the center, perhaps slightly taller than the other two, walked forward slowly. She reached into her pocket and held out a small red object, carefully folded, delicate yet precise. A paper crane. The moment it touched his palm, something cracked inside him. The little girl tilted her head slightly, studying his face as though trying to make sure he had received the message. Then, in a soft, clear voice, she said, "Mom said you'd understand." For a moment, nothing made sense. The room felt too quiet. The world tilted, just slightly. He stared at the crane in his hand. Red. Perfectly creased. The exact shade, the exact design. His mind flew back 7 years without his permission, to another hand that once made these birds for him. One woman. The only one who had ever folded them the same way. Lillian. Her name hit him like a train. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. He hadn't let himself think about her, not really. But now, with this red crane burning in his palm and 3 pairs of identical blue eyes watching him like he was supposed to know something, he did. He knew. Deep in his bones. These weren't just children. These were her children. And if he was honest with himself, he already suspected the rest. His fingers tightened around the paper crane. His voice, unused to uncertainty, came out softer than he intended. "Who are you?" he asked, barely recognizing his own tone. One of the girls, maybe the youngest, answered calmly. "We're Emma, Grace, and Sophie." He swallowed. Something in the way she said it made his heart sink. "And your mother?" he managed to say. "She's in the hospital," said the first girl again. She said, "It's important that you talk to her before it's too late." Alexander Weston, who had once refused to believe in anything he couldn't quantify, fate, love, signs, second chances, felt his carefully built reality begin to unravel. The past had not only returned. It had found a way to stand before him in living form, with small shoes and hopeful eyes. And as he looked at those girls, his asterisk girls, though he hadn't earned the right to think of them that way yet, he felt, for the first time in years, truly afraid. Not of failure. Not of scandal. Afraid that he might be too late. He couldn't remember how he got to the elevator. The crane was still in his hand, slightly crumpled from how tightly he was holding it. His phone lay forgotten on his desk, and his assistant's voice calling after him blurred into the background. The only thing he saw clearly were the girls, walking quietly behind him through the marble lobby, attracting puzzled looks from staff and passers-by. But no one stopped them. Somehow, everyone sensed something significant was happening, like the air itself had changed. Outside, the city moved in its usual frantic rhythm. Taxis honked. Tourists took photos. People stared into screens as if the world existed only inside their devices. But to Alexander, the noise had receded into a dull hum. The chaos of New York didn't reach him now. His mind had collapsed into a tunnel focused on one thing, Lillian Hart. The name echoed inside him, sharper than memory. He hadn't heard it aloud in 7 years, hadn't dared to think of her for more than a few seconds at a time. Not because he didn't care, but because caring had felt dangerous. Back then, he'd convinced himself that he had no choice. He was building something enormous. He didn't have time for late-night talks about dreams or spontaneous picnics in the park. He didn't need paper birds or whispered wishes under the stars. He needed results, success, control. He had told himself she would move on. And if there was pain when she stood in his apartment doorway for the last time, her hands trembling as she handed him one final crane, he buried it so deep inside that it could never rise again. But now the paper bird was in his palm once more, and the pain had risen like a flood. He looked at the girls in the back seat of the car. They sat quietly, watching the city roll by. Not fidgeting. Not talking. Just present. There was something eerie in their calm, something that reminded him of Lillian, the quiet intensity, the stillness beneath the surface. The smallest one, Sophie, held another crane in her lap. A blue one this time. She traced its folded wings with her fingers gently, like it was alive. He turned back toward the window, suddenly afraid of what he might say if he kept looking at them. How could he ask the questions screaming inside his head? Did they know who he was? Did Lillian tell them? Did they hate him for not being there? And what kind of man was he, that he didn't even know he had daughters, 3 of them? The hospital wasn't far. Just a few minutes uptown, in a quiet corner of the Upper West Side, nestled between stone buildings and shaded trees. It wasn't flashy or new. It was the kind of place someone chose carefully, someone who didn't want attention but needed trust. The car pulled up, and Emma, the oldest, or at least the most composed, reached for the door handle without waiting for him. The others followed, moving with that same silent understanding that had unnerved him from the start. Inside, the walls were white and still, the lights soft. A nurse greeted them, her eyes flicking with recognition when she saw the girls. Without asking, she said, "Room 216, and nodded toward the elevator. Alexander followed blindly, his chest tightening with every step. Outside the room, he paused. His hand hovered over the door handle, but he couldn't bring himself to push it yet. He glanced at the girls. Grace looked up at him and gave the smallest of nods, not exactly encouraging, just confirming that this moment was real. He stepped inside. The room was dim. A vase of dying lilies sat on the window ledge. The 4 beeped softly in the background. And there she was. Lillian. Her hair was shorter now, her skin paler, but it was her. The curve of her cheek, the way her fingers rested lightly on the blanket, the tilt of her head even in sleep, it all rushed back to him. It was unbearable, this collision between memory and reality. Her body looked fragile, but her presence was still magnetic. She hadn't lost that quiet gravity that used to stop his mind in its tracks. She opened her eyes slowly, and when she saw him, she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It barely touched her lips. But it hit him harder than any accusation could have. I was starting to think the crane wouldn't make it, she whispered, her voice barely above air. He tried to answer, but his throat had locked. He looked down at the red paper crane still in his hand and then back at her. Her eyes followed the movement, and for a second, they sparkled, not with triumph, not even relief, but something deeper. Something almost like forgiveness. I didn't know, he said at last, his voice breaking in the middle. I know, she replied. He pulled the chair closer and sat down. For the first time in years, he didn't care about schedules or headlines or stock prices. He didn't care about how long he had avoided this or why. All that mattered was the woman in front of him and the years between them that neither could take back. I should have been there, he said quietly. Yes, she agreed. But you're here now. And in that moment, surrounded by machines and shadows, with 3 little girls sitting just outside the door, Alexander Weston, once the most calculating man in the city, began to feel something he had forgotten how to recognize. He was beginning to remember what love really looked like. The first night was the hardest. He stayed in the hospital room long after the girls had fallen asleep in the family lounge down the hall. Nurses came and went, adjusting Lillian's for or checking her vitals, whispering softly around him as if they knew something sacred was unfolding. He didn't move. He sat in the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped in front of him like he was praying, though he hadn't spoken to any god in decades. The room smelled like antiseptic and lavender soap. The soft beeping of machines was the only rhythm keeping his thoughts from spiraling into panic. Lillian slept, her chest rising and falling with the slow, careful breath of someone whose body was conserving every bit of strength it had left. Occasionally, her lips would twitch, or her brow would furrow, like her dreams were heavier than her frame could carry. He couldn't stop watching her. Every moment felt like a gift he didn't deserve. 7 years gone, and somehow, she looked exactly the same and impossibly different. She was still beautiful, but it was a quieter beauty now, fragile, etched with suffering, yet lit by something that felt like peace. He remembered the last time he saw her, standing in the doorway of his apartment with tears in her eyes and a crane in her hand. He remembered the way she had asked him, just once, to stay, not forever, not even for the night, but just long enough to tell her he still saw her. And he had turned away. He told himself at the time that it was necessary, that his career couldn't afford softness. He was building something too big, too important, and there was no room in it for a woman who folded paper birds and talked about things like fate. What a fool he had been. Now, sitting in that sterile room, the weight of what he had walked away from felt unbearable. And yet, even in that guilt, there was something deeper blooming beneath the pain, an overwhelming sense of responsibility, of clarity. Not just about Lillian, but about the 3 girls who had entered his life so suddenly and completely. His daughters. His daughters. He still couldn't say the words aloud. They felt too big. Too sacred. He had missed their births, their first words, their first steps. He hadn't even known their names until a few hours ago. And yet, when he saw them, he didn't feel like a stranger. He felt something ancient and instinctive rise in him, something that told him they belonged to him and he to them. That somehow, even in his absence, something inside him had been waiting for them all along. Lillian stirred. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and for a moment she looked at him without speaking, as if she were trying to memorize the shape of his face again after so many years. He shifted closer, afraid to break the moment. "You haven't changed much," she said, her voice rough from sleep but laced with a soft, almost amused sadness. "Still stubborn. Still quiet when it matters." He let out a shaky breath. "You should have told me." Her eyes didn't leave his. "I wanted to. So many times. But every time I thought about it, I pictured you just, walking away again. I didn't want the girls to grow up with that kind of silence." "I wouldn't have," he said quickly, then stopped. "No. That's not true. I don't know what I would have done back then. I wasn't ready to hear it. But I should have been." I should have been better. She didn't argue. That was one thing he had always admired about her, she didn't sugarcoat truth. She let it sit between them like a living thing, waiting to be acknowledged. They asked about you, she said after a moment. When they were little, they thought maybe you were an astronaut. Or a spy. Or a prince in hiding. His chest tightened. What did you tell them? That you were someone I once loved very much. Someone who made me cranes and made me cry. Someone I hoped they'd meet one day, when they were ready. When you were ready. He didn't deserve that kind of grace. He didn't deserve her. I don't know how to be a father, he said quietly. You'll learn, she replied. They're good girls. Smart. Kind. They already like you, even if they don't understand why yet. Just be present. They'll do the rest. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his face with both hands, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with time zones or business deals. Everything inside him felt raw and rearranged. I missed everything, he said finally. Lillian turned her head toward the window. Outside, the lights of the city blinked gently in the darkness. You missed a lot, she said. But not everything. You're here now, and I don't know how much time I have left, Alex. But I know this, if you want to know them, really know them, there's still time. They're not angry. They're just waiting. Kids have a way of opening doors we don't even realize are still unlocked. He didn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he reached into his pocket and carefully smoothed out the red crane the girls had given him earlier. He placed it gently on the windowsill beside the vase of lilies. It stood there, bright against the pale light, a tiny symbol of hope, of a beginning. She watched him do it, and for the first time, her smile reached her eyes. Do you remember the first one I gave you? She asked. He nodded. Before my first pitch meeting. You said it was for luck. And you closed the deal. I didn't believe in luck. No, she said softly. But I did. And I believed in you. He looked at her, and something in him shifted, something that had been frozen for years finally starting to thaw. I want to fix this, he whispered. Then start with them, she said. Start with the girls. Show them that their father is more than the man who left. And just like that, something changed. Not in the room, not in the air, but in him. A crack in the armor. A sliver of light. A quiet, terrifying, exhilarating sense that it wasn't too late after all. The next morning began in a silence that felt different than the silence of the night before. It wasn't heavy with shock or uncertainty, it was thoughtful, almost reverent, like the world around them was holding its breath. Alexander sat on the small couch in Lillian's hospital room, a blanket over his shoulders that one of the nurses had quietly draped there sometime during the night. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had caught him at last, folding his body forward in a restless, guarded sleep filled with flashes of memories he hadn't visited in years. Now, in the pale light of dawn, he was awake again, eyes fixed on a small cardboard box on the table near Lillian's bed. She was still sleeping, her breath steady and slow, but her presence filled the room even in rest. He didn't touch the box at first. It looked old, the edges frayed and corners dented slightly from being carried and set down and picked up again too many times. There was no label on it, no writing. Just a simple, unassuming box taped shut with a strip of soft pink washi tape, delicate and familiar. It was the kind Lillian used to seal notes and scrapbooks when they were together, a detail that made his chest ache. Finally, as the sun crept over the skyline outside the window, painting the floor with gold, he reached out and pulled the box gently toward him. He peeled away the tape as if it were something sacred, careful not to tear it. The cardboard flaps unfolded with a quiet sigh, and inside, he found what could only be described as a small universe. Dozens upon dozens of paper cranes, all folded in varying shades of red, blue, and soft cream, were stacked inside, organized by color and size. Some had aged and softened with time, their creases a little worn, while others looked nearly new. Beneath them, nestled like buried treasure, were small slips of folded paper, notes. Letters. So many, tied together with simple ribbons, dated in careful handwriting that hadn't changed at all. He pulled one out at random. The date on it was almost 6 years ago. Carefully, he untied the ribbon and unfolded the note. It was short, just a few lines. Today Emma laughed so hard she fell over backward and bumped her head. I kissed her 3 times and she stopped crying. You would have laughed, your crooked smile. You were always good with her kind of chaos. He stared at the words for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. Then he opened another. Sophie won't go to sleep unless I hum that song you used to whistle while working on your laptop. I didn't know she'd heard it enough to remember. I don't even know what it's called. She just says it makes her feel like the stars are close. And another. Grace asked me today why she doesn't have a dad like other kids at school. I told her she has one, she just hasn't met him yet. That he's doing important things, but that maybe one day he'll come find us. I don't know if I said it for her, or for me. Each letter felt like a thread weaving a tapestry he had never seen, yet had been a part of all along. He was a ghost in their lives, but not a villain. Lillian had never painted him in bitterness. She had spoken of him gently, even in his absence. There was grief in the words, yes, and longing, but there was also grace, an impossible, humbling grace he hadn't earned and might never fully deserve. He wasn't sure how long he sat there reading, pulling letter after letter from the box, each one a piece of a life he had never lived but now desperately wanted to understand. There were entries about birthday parties with handmade cakes, about illnesses and bad dreams and favorite bedtime stories. There were sketches in the margins, Grace's first drawing of a tree, Emma's lopsided cat, Sophie's attempt at writing her name. He found a photo tucked between 2 of the cranes, blurry, candid, clearly taken from a distance. The 3 girls sitting on a blanket in the park, a picnic basket beside them, Lillian's hand reaching toward them from off-camera. It was a perfect moment of ordinary beauty. When he looked up, Lillian was awake. She was watching him quietly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were wet. I didn't mean for you to find that so soon, she said softly, her voice hoarse but steady. But maybe it's better you did. I had no idea, he said, and it was all he could manage. It felt pathetic, but it was the truth. I didn't know you were writing to me all these years. That you were still, thinking of me. I wasn't writing to you, she replied. I was writing for them. And maybe a little for myself. I didn't know if you'd ever come back. But I wanted them to have a record of how much they were loved. How much you were part of them, even if you weren't here. His hands tightened around the letters. He had read so many things in his life, contracts, business proposals, legal documents, but none of them had ever felt like this. None had ever made his chest feel too full to breathe. I don't know how to make up for all of this, he whispered. You can't, she said, without malice. You can't rewrite the past, Alex. But you can choose what you do with the present. You can show them who you are now. That matters more than you think. I want to, he said. More than anything. She smiled faintly, a flicker of the woman he used to know shining through the lines fatigue had drawn across her face. Then start with a story. Tonight. Tell them one about you. Not the CEO. Not the man who lives in glass towers. The boy who learned how to fold a crane because he was trying to impress a girl. He laughed, quietly, the sound unfamiliar in this setting, but not unwelcome. And for the first time, he saw a future, blurry and distant, but real. A future where he could sit at a table with 3 little girls and fold paper cranes with clumsy fingers and tell stories that had nothing to do with money or markets. That night, when the girls came to visit again, he didn't sit stiffly in the corner like he had before. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the floor with them, a paper square in hand, and said, "Let me show you something your mom taught me a long time ago." And as his fingers folded the paper slowly, awkwardly, the girls leaned in, their eyes wide, and a new chapter of their lives quietly began, one made not of apologies, but of presence. The following days passed in a strange rhythm that Alexander had never experienced before. It was nothing like the precision and intensity of boardrooms or investor meetings, where every second was calculated, every word rehearsed, and outcomes were tracked like stock values. This was something entirely different, messier, slower, quieter, but deeper in a way that unsettled and steadied him all at once. He began spending more time at the hospital, arriving early in the mornings before the nurses had changed shifts and leaving only when the girls' eyelids began to flutter with sleep. His phone rang less and less as the hours went by, and eventually, he stopped looking at it altogether. At some point, without announcing it to anyone, he had told his assistant to cancel his upcoming meetings, postpone his travel plans, and pause his role at Weston Tech, whatever that meant in a world where CEOs were expected to exist in 24-hour cycles. The truth was, he didn't care. He didn't want to be the man whose name appeared in headlines anymore. He wanted to be someone whose name meant something at home. Each day brought small, sacred moments, firsts that shouldn't have felt like firsts, but somehow did. He learned how Emma liked her apple slices with the skin peeled off because it's softer that way, and how Grace insisted on carrying her own bag even though it was too big for her shoulders, because I'm the big sister. Sophie, the quietest of the three, had the strongest opinions when she did speak, and he quickly realized she was the most like Lillian, observant, stubborn in the gentlest way, and frighteningly intuitive. She seemed to watch him not just with her eyes, but with something else, something that weighed his intentions. He wanted to earn her trust, not with gifts or promises, but with time. Time he should have given from the beginning. Lillian was still weak, her body ravaged by the slow, unforgiving illness that had taken so much from her, but she never complained. She rested more during the day, her strength waning, and Alexander took over the space that had always been hers, reading to the girls, packing snacks, asking the nurses questions with growing urgency and knowledge. He stopped dressing like a mogul. His sharp suits gave way to soft sweaters and rolled-up sleeves. He started folding cranes again, every night, one for each of the girls. They kept them in their backpacks or under their pillows, tiny symbols of something neither of them could fully explain but all instinctively understood. One morning, as he sat beside Lillian, he told her something he hadn't said to anyone else. "I've been thinking about leaving the company," he said, not looking at her as he spoke, afraid of what her eyes might reveal. Not just a sabbatical. Really leaving. Giving it up. She was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally turned to face her, she didn't look shocked or worried. She looked calm. Almost relieved. "I wondered when you'd say that," she murmured. "I'm not surprised." "You're not?" "No. Because this version of you, the one I'm looking at right now, isn't built for boardrooms anymore. You've changed. I don't know if that's good or bad." "It's real," she said. "And it's what they need. It's what you need, too." He let the silence sit between them for a while. Outside the window, spring had started to make itself known. The trees on the avenue were budding with tentative green, and the sky was the kind of blue that made everything underneath it feel more possible. "I missed so much," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "But now you have a choice. You can either spend your time regretting the past or spend it building something now." That night, he made his choice. He sat the girls down after dinner, all three of them crowded onto the small pull-out sofa in the hospital's family room, legs tucked under them, their attention bouncing between curiosity and excitement. He didn't use a whiteboard or a slideshow. He didn't explain it like a press conference. He just told them a story, his story. He told them about a boy who was so afraid of failure that he built walls instead of bridges. A boy who chased success until he forgot why he wanted it in the first place. And then he told them how that boy met a girl who folded paper cranes and laughed at his need to be perfect. A girl who taught him how to breathe. And how, when he left her, he thought he had made the smart choice. But years later, 3 little girls walked into his office carrying a red crane and changed everything. They listened, wide-eyed, their heads tilted at the same identical angle that made his chest ache with how much of her lived in them. And when he finished, Sophie climbed into his lap without saying a word and curled into him like she had been doing it her whole life. Later that week, he wrote an official letter of resignation. The board didn't understand. Investors panicked. Headlines speculated. Tech titan walks away from empire. But Alexander didn't read any of them. He was too busy walking Sophie to her preschool classroom for the first time, holding Emma's hand through her fear of losing her first tooth, and helping Grace memorize lines for a school play. He wasn't just trying to be part of their lives now. He was trying to build one with them. And every evening, when he returned to the hospital to sit with Lillian, he folded a new crane, handed it to her, and said, "Today I got it a little more right." And she would smile, tuck it into the growing pile on her nightstand, and whisper, "One at a time." April arrived with a kind of deceptive beauty that made the waiting harder. The sky turned brighter, the air softer, and Central Park slowly turned green again, as though nothing in the world could go wrong beneath such a gentle season. But inside the hospital, beneath the warm sunlight filtering through half-open blinds, Lillian was getting worse. At first, the signs were subtle. She grew tired more easily, her words sometimes trailed off mid-sentence, and her appetite, already fragile, all but disappeared. She smiled for the girls, made jokes for Alexander, but when she thought no one was watching, her shoulders slumped and her breathing slowed as if each movement required calculation and restraint. The light in her eyes dimmed slightly every day. Alexander saw it all. He tried not to show it, but the change in him was immediate. He began reading medical journals late at night, consulting with specialists on other continents, funding private research programs at a rate that made his former financial advisors uneasy. He no longer thought in terms of budgets or forecasts. He thought in hours. In minutes. In moments he hadn't had and ones he might still be able to save. He was in the hallway with one of Lillian's doctors when the news came. The specialist, a calm, pragmatic woman with eyes too weary for her age, explained in the quietest, most respectful voice that Lillian's disease had entered an accelerated stage. Time, she said, was not on their side. The treatment that had been helping her slow its progression had stopped working. They could try stronger medication, but it came with severe side effects. One option remained, a rare stem cell-based therapy undergoing clinical trials abroad, available only to patients with a close genetic match willing to donate. The science was new, experimental, but it had shown signs of promise in a handful of cases. The catch was clear, it would require a donor, and the only likely candidates were immediate blood relatives. When Alexander returned to Lillian's room, he didn't speak of it right away. She was asleep, the soft rise and fall of her chest shallow but steady. Her skin looked nearly translucent against the pillow, and yet, even in this state, she radiated that same quiet strength. The same unspoken grace that had always drawn him in without effort. He sat beside her for a long time, one hand wrapped around hers, the other resting on the paper crane he had brought that day. It was yellow. A color she once told him reminded her of morning hope. The next day, he had the girls tested. He didn't explain the full details to them, how could he? They were only 6, still wrapping their heads around the idea of hospitals and illness and what it meant when their mother slept for most of the day. But he spoke gently, honestly, sitting cross-legged on the rug with them while cartoons played quietly in the background. He said the doctors needed to see if their blood could help their mom feel better. That it would mean a little poke, maybe a small test. Emma asked first, "Will it hurt?" and Alexander said, "A little. But it's for something really important." Grace, always the quiet listener, simply nodded, while Sophie took his hand and said, "If it helps her stay longer, then okay." When the results came back, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks, hope. Grace was a perfect match. A miracle, the doctor said. In cases like these, it was extremely rare to find such compatibility, even among family. But somehow, Grace's markers aligned perfectly with what they needed. What followed was one of the hardest conversations of his life. He and Lillian sat together in her room, sunlight pouring in, and he told her everything. Her first instinct was to say no. She couldn't imagine her daughter undergoing a procedure for her sake. The risk was low, the doctors had explained, but it was still invasive. Still frightening. Still unknown. She gripped Alexander's hand with what strength she had and said, "She's too young. She shouldn't have to be brave for me." But Alexander, gently and with tears in his eyes, said something she hadn't expected. "She's already brave. All three of them are. And this isn't just about survival anymore. It's about giving them more time with you, memories that they'll carry longer than the stories I tell them. I think Grace understands more than either of us expected." They waited a full day before speaking to Grace again. This time, both parents together. They spoke slowly, carefully, not hiding the seriousness but not overburdening her with fear. And Grace, after listening silently, climbed up on the bed beside her mother and said, "If it gives you more good days, then I want to do it." The hospital moved quickly after that. Alexander flew in a specialist team from Europe. They converted one of the unused hospital suites into a makeshift recovery space just for Grace, decorating it with her favorite books and soft pillows and a window that looked out over the river. He stayed with her through every test, every explanation, every blood draw. He learned how to braid her hair the way she liked it and brought her small surprises, colored pencils, a stuffed lion, a pink paper crane he folded on his own. He'd never folded pink before, but she loved it. The procedure happened in the third week of April. The doctors didn't sugarcoat the anxiety, they explained the risks, prepared for complications. But everything went smoothly. Grace was strong. She bounced back quicker than expected, demanding cookies and orange juice before the nurses even finished disconnecting the final tubes. Alexander wept in the hallway afterward, not because something had gone wrong, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, something had gone right. Lillian's recovery was slower. The infusion was just the beginning. Her immune system needed time to adjust, and her body was still weak. But within days, the changes were visible. Her eyes grew clearer. Her appetite returned in small but meaningful ways. She could sit up without assistance. Then she could walk across the room with Alexander's arm beneath hers. The nurses began calling her the miracle patient, and while Alexander hated the word, it sounded too much like luck and not enough like choice, he understood what they meant. One evening, about 10 days after the transplant, the whole family sat together in the hospital garden. The girls were drawing chalk hearts on the stone walkway, and Lillian was wrapped in a blanket on a bench, watching them with a serenity that made the air itself feel warmer. Alexander sat beside her, their hands loosely entwined. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. And when she finally turned to him, her eyes filled with tears but her voice steady, she whispered, "You saved me." He shook his head and kissed the back of her hand. "No. Grace saved you. And you saved me long before that. I'm just finally trying to be the man you believed I could be." She rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, they sat without any urgency, without fear, simply existing together. The future was still uncertain. It always would be. But in that moment, surrounded by chalk drawings and warm spring air, they weren't thinking about endings anymore. They were thinking about what could begin. May brought with it a kind of slow magic that Alexander hadn't known he needed. It didn't come in grand gestures or earth-shaking declarations. It came in the quiet, steady rhythm of healing. In Lillian's voice gaining strength one sentence at a time. In the color returning to her cheeks. In the way she walked now, carefully, but without help. The hospital room that had once been a place of waiting and uncertainty transformed into something softer, more like a temporary home, filled with laughter and paper cranes and the smell of apple juice and colored pencils. The girls were there every day after school, curled up on the bed with Lillian, bringing her drawings and stories and questions about things as small as ant colonies and as big as outer space. They talked to her the way only children do, with complete faith that their mother would always be there to answer. By the end of the month, the doctors agreed Lillian could be discharged to finish her recovery at home. It felt surreal to hear those words, home. For a long time, Alexander didn't even know what that meant anymore. He had houses, sure, 3 of them, across different cities, but he hadn't lived in any of them. Not truly. They had been places to sleep, to host meetings, to impress investors. But now he was planning for something different. Something real. He had found a small house just outside the city, tucked away near a lake, quiet and surrounded by trees. It wasn't modern or flashy. It didn't have smart walls or a wine cellar or a private elevator. But it had light. And space. And rooms where the girls could paint the walls whatever colors they wanted. A place with a front porch for rainy days and a backyard big enough to chase fireflies. Lillian had seen the pictures and simply nodded, a tear running down her cheek. It was exactly the kind of place she would have chosen. Moving day was small and beautiful. There were no moving trucks or corporate decorators, just a modest car, a few bags, and the 5 of them holding hands as they stepped across the threshold into a future none of them had expected but all of them now fiercely wanted. The first night, Alexander cooked. It was a disaster, overcooked pasta, a smoke alarm, spilled sauce on the floor, but the girls loved every second of it. They giggled until their stomachs hurt and Lillian, still weak but radiant in her laughter, declared it the best worst dinner she'd ever had. There were no official schedules, no perfectly laid out plans. But slowly, a routine began to form. Morning started with the smell of toast and the sound of feet running down the hall. Alexander learned to pack lunches. He drove them to school, one arm out the window, the other adjusting the rearview mirror to catch their faces. Lillian rested more at first, but as her strength returned, she joined him in small moments, brushing Emma's hair, helping Grace with homework, sitting with Sophie in the garden as she tried to count butterflies. Alexander didn't return to the tech world. Not even in whispers. He didn't host Zoom calls from the kitchen or sneak away to answer emails in the middle of bedtime stories. His old life, so precise, so performative, felt 1,000 years away. Occasionally, someone from Weston Tech would reach out. A board member asking if he wanted to stay on in an advisory role, or a reporter requesting an interview about his sabbatical. He ignored all of it. What he was doing now mattered more than anything he'd ever built with stock or code. One afternoon, he found Lillian in the backyard, sitting barefoot in the grass with a sketchbook in her lap and a cup of tea in her hand. She was drawing the girls. From memory. From motion. From the heart. The lines were loose and soft, alive with movement, and when she looked up at him, he saw that she was drawing again not just with her hands, but with her whole soul. That light was back, the one he had fallen in love with years ago, the one he had walked away from but never forgotten. He sat beside her and didn't say anything for a long time. Just listened to the wind in the trees, the distant laughter of the girls building a fort out of branches, and the heartbeat of a life he never thought he would be allowed to have. Later that evening, Lillian joined him on the porch. She brought out a small jar filled with folded cranes, different sizes, different colors, some crisp and perfect, others rumpled and obviously made by tiny hands. She set the jar on the table between them and said, "I told them every crane is a wish." So they started folding them too. He smiled, picking one up. It was pale blue, folded unevenly, but still beautiful. "What are they wishing for?" "Everything," she said. "Long summers. Nighttime stories. That their dad never stops folding cranes." He looked out at the lake, the reflection of the moon floating quietly across the surface, and something in his chest relaxed for the first time in years. He didn't feel like a man rebuilding his life anymore. He felt like a man living it. That night, after the girls were tucked in and the house had fallen into a peaceful hush, he sat alone in the kitchen with a piece of red paper and folded a crane by memory. He placed it next to the others, but not in the jar. He left it on the windowsill, where the morning sun would touch it first. A silent promise. A reminder. This wasn't luck. This was love, lived on purpose. This was healing, earned one moment at a time. A full year passed, though it didn't feel like 12 months had gone by. It felt like something else entirely, like time had taken on a different texture. It didn't race forward the way it used to in boardrooms and airport lounges. It didn't vanish into emails and meetings and bottom lines. It unfolded. Slowly. Steadily. Purposefully. One morning into the next. One bedtime story into another. The rhythm of life in the Westenhart household had settled into something quiet and sacred. The girls were taller now, their voices stronger and their questions more complex. Grace had developed a love for reading chapter books on her own and was currently obsessed with stories about explorers and maps. Emma had joined a local kids' science club and insisted on mixing strange potions in the kitchen with plastic test tubes. Sophie, ever observant, had started painting beside her mother, watching Lillian's hand with quiet reverence, then imitating her strokes on her own canvas with remarkable skill for her age. Lillian was stronger too. Her health had stabilized far beyond what doctors had predicted. There were still follow-ups, regular tests, and careful monitoring, but she was no longer a patient. She was a mother again. A partner. A woman who could walk through her garden barefoot at sunrise with a coffee in hand and a sketchbook tucked under her arm. Her laughter had become a common sound in the house, and her presence no longer carried the weight of fear. It carried warmth. Presence. Continuity. Alexander had changed most of all. People in town now knew him simply as Alex. Not Mr. Weston. Not the CEO. Just the man who picked up his daughters from school and volunteered to help build birdhouses for the local nature reserve. He no longer wore suits. He no longer talked about acquisitions. He had taken up woodworking, not because he was good at it, but because it allowed him to make things with his hands instead of a keyboard. He made a bookshelf for Grace, a toy chest for Sophie, and a dollhouse for Emma that took him 2 months but became her most treasured possession. He was the man who read out loud at bedtime, who fixed squeaky doors, who sometimes burned breakfast but always served it with a smile. One evening in early June, as twilight softened the sky, Lillian gathered the family in the yard. The air was thick with the scent of blooming lilacs, and the girls had just returned from picking wildflowers along the edge of the lake. They were barefoot and sun-kissed, streaked with dirt and happiness, their arms full of color. Lillian held a large box in her hands, wrapped in fabric instead of paper, and inside it were 100 paper cranes. Each folded by the family over the course of the year, some tiny and fragile, others large and creased with pride. They were every color imaginable, every kind of fold, the careful, the imperfect, the experimental. Each one had a date, a name, or a memory scribbled inside its wing. It wasn't something they had planned. It had just happened. One at a time, one day at a time. "We're going to send them," Lillian said softly, looking around at her family. "Every wish. Every moment. Every lesson we learned." She had prepared a small floating lantern for each crane, light, biodegradable, carefully tied with fishing wire to make sure the cranes would stay safe and upright. Alexander helped light the lanterns, and the girls placed the cranes one by one, whispering things as they did. Some were prayers. Some were secrets. Some were just giggles. Then they carried the lanterns to the edge of the water. The sky was dark enough now to reflect the stars, and the lake was still. They released the cranes together, watching as they drifted out slowly, a trail of soft light and hope moving away from the shore. It wasn't just beautiful. It was profound. It was a letting go, not of the past, but of the pain that once came with it. A celebration of how far they had come. of what they had chosen to build together. After the last crane had floated far enough that its light was only a flicker, Grace turned to Alexander and asked the question he hadn't expected. "Do you ever miss your company?" He looked down at her, this girl who had once saved her mother's life, who had quietly become the heartbeat of their new world, and smiled. "I used to think Weston Tech was the most important thing I would ever build," he said. "But then I met you. And now I know better." Lillian took his hand. Emma leaned against his side. Sophie hugged his arm and closed her eyes, breathing deeply like she was memorizing the moment. They stood like that for a long while, saying nothing, watching the water glow with the last of the lanterns, surrounded by the silence of things finally set right. Inside the house, above the fireplace, there was a new shelf, simple, hand-carved, slightly uneven. On it stood just one object. A single red paper crane, carefully protected in a glass dome. The one that started everything. The one that had walked back into his life held in the tiny hand of a girl he didn't yet know was his daughter. Below the crane, engraved into a small wooden plaque, were 4 words. "She said you'd understand." And now, he did. Completely. This story, at its core, is not about regret, it's about redemption. It's about how time lost can never be reclaimed, but meaning can still be made in the time we have left. What makes the ending powerful is its quietness. There's no grand finale, no cinematic explosion of drama. Instead, there is something much rarer, peace earned slowly, love rebuilt carefully, and healing that doesn't erase the scars but honors them. The red paper crane becomes more than a symbol. It's a message across years, a reminder that some love doesn't disappear, it waits, quietly, patiently, until we are ready to return to it. Alexander's transformation isn't about abandoning success. It's about redefining it. He doesn't lose his identity, he reclaims a truer one. What I love most is that this story doesn't offer a fantasy escape. It offers a possible reality. It dares to suggest that people can change, that second chances don't always come wrapped in perfection, and that the softest victories, like a little girl's forgiveness or a quiet family dinner, are often the most profound. It doesn't ask if we can go back. It asks something braver. What will you do with the time you have now?